welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're going to put on our detective hats and act as behavioral profilers to unpack this hidden silent language that, well, we all speak every single day. We're looking at the true anatomy of a secret, decoding the nonverbal communication that constantly, and I mean constantly, reveals our inner worlds.
Okay, let's just dive right into a seriously mind-blowing statistic. When you're communicating emotions face-to-face with someone, a massive 93% of the meaning comes from nonverbal channels. Let that sink in. 55% is derived entirely from your body movement and facial expressions, and 38% comes from your vocal tone. That leaves only a tiny 7% sliver for the actual words you say. You are literally speaking volumes before you even open your mouth.
To decode that remaining 93%, we've got a lot of ground to cover today. We're going to journey through the history of this silent language, drill down into our biology, cross some cultural boundaries, and then things get really intense. We'll step into the interrogation room before finally looking at what AI means for the future of reading minds.
Let's start right at the beginning with how humanity has historically obsessed over this silent orchestra of the body.
You know, humanity has always tried to decode the body. Way back in the ancient era, you had Greco-Roman Chironomia, which was the technical refinement of rhetorical gestures, alongside the ancient Eastern diagnostic tradition of Vedic Samudrika Shastra, where they analyzed body features to predict destiny. Pretty wild, right? Then, jumping ahead to the 17th century, a guy named John Bulwer introduced his corporal philosophy, arguing that body language is this universal character of reason. But things really clicked in the 20th century with sociologist Goffman. He brilliantly distinguished between the expressions we intentionally give using our words and those we accidentally give off with our bodies. And honestly, it's those expressions given off that reveal who we really are.
Moving from history to hard science, let's examine the exact biological machinery that makes those expressions given off possible.
So the crucial takeaway here is that every subtle gesture, like a sudden clenched fist or a quick furrowed brow, starts at a microscopic molecular level. It all kicks off when acetylcholine is released at the neuromuscular junction. This then triggers a flood of calcium ions that bind to troponin. And finally, ATP gets used to pull the actin filaments, shortening the muscle fiber. Now, to put that into perspective for our daily lives, before you even realize you're angry, this ultra-precise sequence of chemical releases and muscle contractions has already betrayed you. It's an instant physical reaction happening milliseconds before your conscious mind can even catch up.
And this creates a fascinating neurological tug-of-war happening right inside our heads. We essentially have two distinct motor control pathways fighting it out. The pyramidal system originates in the primary motor cortex and controls what we want to show. Think of that conscious posed smile you put on for a group photo. But competing against it is the extrapyramidal system, which operates subcortically. This system is completely reflexive. It manages involuntary movements milliseconds faster than our conscious brain can possibly react. So it's literally a losing battle for our conscious mind. And this exact dynamic is what experts call emotional leakage.
Underneath all this tug-of-war, a highly sophisticated network of brain regions is constantly churning away. Your amygdala is on the lookout, detecting social threats and fear before you're even consciously aware of them. Meanwhile, your action observation network works to decode the real meaning behind other people's movements using a neat process called repetition suppression. And your cerebellum? It's coordinating your posture and balance, constantly serving as a primary indicator of whether you feel confident or submissive in whatever room you just walked into.
Now, what's really interesting is how we physically position ourselves to communicate all of this without making a single sound.
The study of this space is called proxemics. Anthropologist Edward T. Hall mapped out 4 invisible bubbles that we all carry around with us in Western societies. You've got your intimate zone from 0 to 18 inches, which is strictly reserved for close relationships. Then you have the personal zone, the social zone, and finally the public zone. These invisible boundaries dictate exactly how close someone can get before we feel a sudden, jarring spike of discomfort. Just think about the last time a stranger stood just a little too close to you in an elevator. We are constantly and silently negotiating this invisible real estate.
And when it comes to haptics, which is the communicative power of touch, things get even more complex. It's fascinating to note that touch isn't always about warmth or intimacy like we often assume. In fact, higher status individuals are significantly more likely to initiate strategic touch toward their subordinates. A pat on the back or a guided hand on the shoulder? Well, that is frequently a subconscious display of dominance and power, not just a friendly gesture.
Let's shift gears a bit and see how these complex rules completely change depending on your geography and demographics.
Because, make no mistake, body language is absolutely not a universal monolith. There are stark, dramatic variations across the globe. For example, Latin American and Middle Eastern cultures are often contact cultures, meaning they naturally stand much closer than non-contact Northern European cultures. Furthermore, an action like maintaining direct eye contact means honesty and confidence in the West, but it can be viewed as highly aggressive in many Asian cultures. And showing the sole of your shoe or using your left hand for certain tasks, that can be a grave insult in places like the Middle East and India. You could be speaking the local language flawlessly, but your body might be highly offensive.
Research also consistently shows that gender heavily influences her silent signals. Women generally display higher decoding accuracy, particularly when it comes to judging facial expressions, and they tend to utilize more active listening cues and fluid gestures. Conversely, men tend to command larger personal space, adopt much more expansive, wider postures, and use sharp, directed movements, often as a subconscious challenge of power in professional settings.
Okay, things are about to get intense. We've reached the interrogation room, where we apply all this biology and sociology to the high-stakes science of detecting deception. It's the ultimate behavioral question, isn't it? Can you really spot a liar just by looking at them? Well, the answer doesn't lie in a single magical tell, like someone looking up and to the left. That's a myth. Rather, the true science of deception lies in looking for tiny, split-second discrepancies between the verbal story a person is telling and those involuntary physical signals we talked about earlier.
Professional deception detection requires a highly systematic approach. First, you absolutely must establish a baseline of a person's normal state when they are completely relaxed. Second, you look for microexpressions. These are flashes of genuine emotion that last just 1/25 of a second before the conscious brain suppresses them. Finally, you utilize the rule of 3. A single foot tap, that means nothing, but finding concurrent clusters of 3 or more involuntary stress signs, say eye avoidance, throat clearing, and foot wiggling all happening at the exact same time, well, that's when a behavioral detective takes serious notice.
However, we must be incredibly careful here to avoid what is known as the Othello Error. This is such a critical concept. The Othello Error reminds us that signs of high emotional arousal look exactly the same whether a person is lying or if they are just terrified of not being believed. Misinterpreting a truthful person's severe stress as direct evidence of guilt is a classic and, frankly, incredibly dangerous mistake.
And this is incredibly relevant in legal settings. Jurors are constantly looking for a hidden narrative. They engage in offstage observations, judging attorneys and witnesses who aren't even on the stand. Throw in the Rosenthal effect, which is where people subconsciously modify their behavior to meet the expectations of an authority figure, like a judge, and you can clearly see how nonverbal cues can literally change the outcome of a trial. For our final section, let's explore the cutting edge of this field, where machines are learning to read us better than we can read ourselves.
AI algorithms are now stepping in as the ultimate decoders. Machine learning can analyze incredibly subtle microgestures, like your gait, tiny hand tremors, or shifting facial features to diagnose health conditions like Parkinson's or ADHD with astonishing accuracy. We're seeing wearables provide real-time personalized interventions for anxiety based purely on physiological data. There are, however, major risks when it comes to algorithmic bias. If AI models are trained on narrow or non-diverse datasets, they could entirely misinterpret the cultural body language variations we talked about earlier.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought for today's explainer. We now know that our biology is hardwired to leak our true feelings, and technology is becoming ruthlessly efficient at catching those leaks. So, in a world increasingly monitored by smart technology and algorithms, how hyper-aware are you of the silent signals you are constantly leaving behind? It's definitely something to think about the next time you cross your arms or step just a little too close into someone's personal space. Thanks for learning with us today.